I too have lost children. And as I watched this interview with Toby Mac, so many things resonated with me. He's a celebrity Christian. He sings Christian music. And so he has to, or likely feels the pressure, and you can see this in the interview, to do this, right? I mean, everyone's looking at him as, this celebrity Christian figure, and he feels the pressure to do it right. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner, mental health professional for over 25 years. I've lost 3 children, not all at once, over the course of 20 years, and lost my husband. And I too feel pressure to do it right. I've been a Christian since I was 19, so I have a pressure of like doing it right according to Christians. I feel the pressure to do it right according to mental health. And I can tell you, and Toby Mac talks about this too, nothing prepares you for losing a child. Toby Mac talks about his spiritual experiences, and I'm going to break those down and share my similar experiences. But you can see some of his hesitation to sharing those things with his viewers. And I have felt shame and doubt about my journey. And just to be perfectly vulnerable, like I have felt judged by Christians. If you've seen my documentary, I go on a spiritual quest and there is no limit to what I will try. And this is after losing my 3rd child. And one of my dearest friends, after seeing the documentary, said to me, "That is not the way of Jesus." And I hope you watch this, and I know it wasn't meant to hurt. But what happens when we tell people how they should process horrible things in their life that you have no idea how hard they are? You produce shame in the person. Another time, it's happened passively a couple times, but that one was outwardly. And then I sent the film to my friend who is a pastor who, my question was, could this be shown in a church? And he couldn't even tell me face to face. He wrote it in an email. And I don't know why I was surprised. I guess part of me really wants my Christian friends to understand how I am closer to God after this pain than I was when I was clearly following the teachings of the church. And so I'm going to go through this interview with Toby Mac, who also, this Christian celebrity who lost his son. And I'm going to show you some of the parallels that I've experienced and my challenge to the church as a whole, right? Believers as a whole, not the building and the government of the building, but you, the people who believe in a loving, protective God. If you've lost a child or you know someone who's lost a child, that doesn't feel like love. And it certainly doesn't feel like protection. So I have made my life work about turning my pain into purpose. This video is more about the spiritual growth that I have experienced from actually trying to work through this pain. And there's 3 common things between my story and Toby Mac, in that there was spiritual growth that doesn't necessarily align with what we were taught. That counseling and seeking help is good and shouldn't be shunned. And 3rd, community is our biggest support. So Toby Mac starts with, grief comes in waves. And this is hard to explain to people because sometimes I can get behind this camera and speak with confidence. And sometimes it's still raw, it still hurts. And I don't feel so confident in my story, right? Same when we're out there. He talks about, I started to learn how to laugh again, not laugh as deeply. I don't know if I'll ever laugh as deeply again. I don't know if I'll ever smile as big, but I can smile and I can laugh. Whew. That has been so true in my story and so many people that I help that are going through the grief, like even when you're doing it and you're processing and you're feeling the pain and you're working through your spiritual conflict, this changes you forever. It is a trauma. It's not just grief. So many people talk about grief being normal, and we all experience grief, and we do. And so I want you to try to relate to our grief. This is very important. Toby Mac talks about a story of someone he met before his son even died that had lost a son. And then that person reached out to him after he lost his son. The guy goes on to say to him, make sure you know God and that you're holding on and you're grabbing onto God, the real God, not the God that you were taught or the God that you want to believe. And, he says, the promise is that God will never leave you or forsake you. And I personally had a hard time with that one as well, because to me, losing my children was forsaking me, right? And so words matter, language matters, whether you're ready to hear something matters. And I can tell you, when I lost Johnny in 2005, all my kids were still young, and he was 13. He died in a drowning accident, and he was one of my 5 adopted children. And I only say that because of the dynamics that happened did matter. And he had 2 biological sisters that I just put all my energy into making sure that they were okay, that this grief, this another loss, and they had been through previous trauma, wasn't going to impact them. And I truly believe that if I just taught the ways of God, it would be instilled in them. And so I did it in a very black and white way. And yes, I had a relationship with God, but the relationship I have with God now, I would have parented very, very differently after that first grief. But I did not question God. This is God's plan. He brought Johnny into our life. If you know my story, we were only going to adopt one boy, and we walked into that foster care facility, and they said, oh, by the way, those are his 2 sisters, and they've never been separated. And so we adopted a 3-child sibling group when the intent was to just adopt one more. And so, I kept in this was God's plan. God brought Johnny, and, for us to have our 2 daughters, and never wavered. Shortly after that, my son got sick with catastrophic epilepsy, later diagnosed with a rare neurodegenerative condition. And we had 10 years of medical trauma. And I truly believe God said that keep fighting, I'm going to save Reggie. And people would say, well, maybe, that means he's going to be healed in the next life. And I truly believe that God had told me that Reggie was going to be healed in this earth. So when he died, that was my first spiritual conflict, and I heard from him, but there was no wavering from the doctrinal truths that I was taught. But when my daughter died in her sleep of unexpected death and epilepsy, and she had never spent the night in the hospital, she was not sick, that was it. That was my breaking point of I can't just blindly believe that God loves me. So I go back to Toby Mac's interview because this is parallel. He said, even though I was a public Christian figure, I don't think I ever really spoke about eternity. I don't think I ever really even thought about it. Yes, I've always trusted God, and I knew that when I died, I would go to heaven. And I'd imagine, people who have died being in heaven. And I had this kind of picture. But he hesitates in the interview, and he says, I'm going to try to say this without crying. But he's hesitating because he doesn't want to share this spiritual experience, because oftentimes in the church, people talk about not being able to communicate with the dead. And when my son died in 2016, he came to me and said almost these exact words. So Toby Mac's son came to him and said, Dad, if you could only see what I see now. And then, he's kind of reluctant to keep going. And he he's reluctant, and he's kind of saying, leaving this earth early isn't necessarily a ripoff, and it's not necessarily what heaven looks like. It's more how things work. And he goes on to say what his son said to him. Dad, you don't get it. You don't get it at all. He heard and saw his son. There was a connection, an eternal connection with him and his son. Reggie said almost the exact same words to me. He said, Mama, you think you're so smart. You have no idea. And when I heard that Toby Mac's son said almost the same thing, it helped validate. It gave me joy and confidence to know that that was true. But I'll tell you, at the time, I rationalized it. And in the first version of my book, I was like, well, God spoke, probably spoke to me in Reggie's voice. But like I said, when Maya died 5 years later, that's it. I can't keep it in this doctrinal box anymore. I have to have a real, authentic connection with God. So Toby Mac talks about things that you can do dealing with grief and loss. There is help and hope. We all grieve differently. There is beauty in counseling. And the most important thing is community. Praying for people that you love, reaching out to people that you love. And I shared in the beginning that I've been a little hurt by feeling judged of how I'm grieving. And some of the things that I did in my 45 days of grief not being the way of Jesus. Whether you are a Christian, not a Christian, listening, we have to have an eternal belief system. If we think this world is it, then grief of this magnitude is unbearable. But I can find my purpose in my pain. I think Toby Mac just, doing that interview has likely helped a lot of people. And I get lots of questions around this. And for example, I have a friend who lost her son in a drunk driving accident. He was the passenger, and they were very young. She is a Christian, and she has been told that she can't connect, that, going to a medium or someone who does have those gifts would be sinful. Whether you are a Christian watching this because you want to support somebody in grief, or you are grieving, eternity is not just forever. It's right now. And I know this to be true. And it is one of the things that Maya has shared with me after her passing, that time and space is not real. It's a human limitation. And if you're judging me from how I grieve to get to this point, just take a moment. And could you go through what I've gone through, what so many mothers have gone through, parents have gone through? And I love what Toby Mac's friend said. If you are adamant that you're only going to hold on to the promises of God, make sure you're holding on to real promises. And God will never leave you. That is an absolute promise. To forsake you, I think language and wording might mean something else. He will never leave you. He is there by your side. He is accessible. And just stopping to listen. We often talk about prayer, lifting up prayer. Like, these are things we want. We're saying, God, I want this. But do we stop and listen? That's what meditation is. Meditation is stopping and listening. Whether you call it God, the source, are you listening? In our fear of some of these techniques, and I went to a medium, I learned a little bit about tarot cards, I did Reiki, I did acupuncture. These are various things to connect and to stop and listen. And we can do that in prayer, but prayer is not just talking, it's receiving. And so making sure that we are stopping to listen. And if you are going through grief and really struggling with judgment on how you're going through grief, have grace and empathy for yourself. Grief changes us. all grief, even normal grief or grief that, we don't think is intense or traumatic. But losing a child is traumatic grief. If you have lost a child, I have tons of free resources on YouTube. Just start going through the grief playlist. You can see everything from me vulnerably grieving. Give us your email address. We'll invite you to see the documentary and just be a part of this community that is willing to talk about grief.